Hello and welcome to Pagero Live, a new initiative designed to promote knowledge in the public sector. My name's Tom, and over the next hour, we'll be talking about the budget's impact on the public sector with our panel of industry experts. If you could introduce yourself, please, starting with Julia.
Hi, my name's Julia Goldsworthy. I'm Head of Social Impact Investment at Legal & General.
Rob.
Hi all, Rob Turner. I'm a Director in Grant Thornton's Public Services Advisory Team.
And last but by no means least, Aman.
Hi, I'm Aman Bergen, CFO at the Pagero Group.
Thank you, everybody. So today's session is very much like our other Pagero Lives in that it's a Q&A session. We're going to be going through some of the key takeaways from October's budget, where the barriers and opportunities have come from that, and what impact it'll have on investment and funding. We'd also love it if you as the audience could get involved as well. So please feel free to ask as many questions as you'd like using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It may have moved if you've had an update on Zoom, but it's still there under the More Options section. We'll also be running polls as usual throughout the session, so that will help us guide the conversation. So please make sure that you are responding to those as they come through. And as we expect, here we go, the first one popping up now. So Matt, if you could set that poll live, please. This is for our audience. How aware are you of the key changes facing the public sector following October's budget? I'll give you 30 seconds just on answering that. So it was a hugely significant budget, the first Labour budget for 14 years, and some key fallout has happened from it over the last week or so. So we'll get onto some of those topics throughout the webinar. Matt, if you could close that poll now, please. So interestingly there's what we're looking at there. So around 66, so 2/3 of the people in attendance don't feel particularly aware of the key changes facing the public sector following the budget. So a nice base level for us to go from there, and hopefully we'll help build some of that knowledge throughout today's webinar. So what we'll do is to get into it with our first question, I'm going to go through each panelist in turn and just ask you what your top takeaways for the public sector to be aware of from the budget. I'm going to start with you on this one, Julia.
Yeah, so I think as with all budgets, quite often it can take a while just to actually learn what the true picture is. You never get the full picture on the day. And as we've seen with some of the protests over this week on inheritance tax changes for farmers, and winter fuel payments, stuff like that, we're still seeing some of that play out. But I suppose the key takeaway for the public sector is it's only part of the process. We've got a spending review coming next year. We had the Mansion House speech from Rachel Reeves last week talking more about how we can drive investment to support growth. So I suppose my takeaway would be, yes, it sets the tax to spend envelope, but there's plenty more devil in the detail to be worked out.
Yeah, a really good point to start us off with. Rob, your thoughts on this one, please.
Yeah, I think sort of similar to Julia. Obviously, we had the kind of headlines around an absolute focus on growth and growth and growth, whilst at the same time, this idea that actually it's growth that needs to be felt in people's pockets. So the proverbial sort of person on the street should feel the benefit of this. So we saw some of those smaller things like minimum wage and things like that will have an impact on people. I guess the question is, as you try and balance that growth versus impact on people, it's what does that mean and how feasible that is. So we've seen, as Julia rightly said, it's not landed particularly well with businesses. You will see headlines around sort of handbrakes on growth and things like that. And we know that there are a number of big public services that are severely financially challenged, and this budget wasn't the answer for them. So we've got this kind of challenge that exists, and actually it's when you get into the small print, there's lots of promises of new white papers, and I suppose, to borrow Julia's phrase, the devil will be in the detail on those. And actually that's, I think, where we really start to see where the change may be made in the public sector, be that new industrial strategy, the phrase around local government reorganisation, which has potential to be huge for local authorities, but also kind of further devolution and fiscal devolution and things like that. We just don't know what they mean. They all could be very big, though.
Excellent. Thanks, Rob. And then Aman?
Yeah, no, look, to add to what the guys said there, I think for me it was encouraging to see the sort of commitment to the Procurement Act 2023 from Rachel Reeves, and a real commitment to digital for the public sector, and obviously the introduction of the government new department around Office for Value for Money. So for me, it was in addition to, yes, we're growing. I think there was the commitment from the budget on some of the initiatives that were already going and trying to drive that around. Actually, this is about unlocking efficiency and unlocking that through digital, which I think for the public sector is an opportunity to unlock that. I think also adding to that for the public sector, it's thinking about, okay, so we're adding a lot of investment in here, albeit we're not quite sure what that means. Actually, is the supply chain in a position to deliver on that, whether that's a construction project or anything related to that? And I think that's a big consideration, that came out for me, which was, okay, there's lots of investment, but are we ready? So which channels is it coming from? That's important, but actually, are we as a country and a supply chain ready to deliver on that? So I think those were the things from my perspective.
Well, thanks, guys. Some really good top line stuff there to dig into a little bit more as we go throughout this webinar. So we'll kind of go into, I guess it's a bit of a two-part question, really, as in which sectors within the public sector have seen the biggest sort of changes and challenges from the budget, and what was missing from it. We'll go to you on this one first, Rob.
Yeah, I guess in some ways, no sector's seen kind of dramatic change. I think obviously there have been some additional spending, which if you're in those sectors, that is welcome, but not kind of nearly enough. And so I think there's not that big a change. I think the things that are missing for me, and this isn't necessarily a criticism, it's the first budget of a new government. They're coming in a very challenging fiscal environment. But I think one of the big issues is this kind of sort of single year spending settlements, single year, everything's quite short term. If what's missing is the ability to try and go longer term, try and agree some kind of longer term plans and commitments so that you can actually start to introduce something that will be quite transformational across, whether that be local government, NHS, or particular services within, so the sort of social care, which kind of crosses both of those departments. So I think that's something that's missing for me. And just to build on what we kind of sort of said in the opening, I think then there's just some details. So as I say, local government reorganisation, fiscal devolution, those could have very big change for places and the different services that operate in there. Labour are talking about kind of co-creating those with the sector, wanting to work with people, which I think is really encouraging. But what's missing is really where they want to go on that. And people are going to need to know that information pretty soon, because people want to start to make decisions. They'll want to be able to start to kind of put in place strategies and plans locally. And that's going to be really key. And I think without that, there is just this vacuum, and people get nervous when there's vacuums.
Julia, I can see you nodding along there. Does that sort of tally with your views on it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what will certainly be interesting to see how things play out as we run in now from budget into spending review is what mission-based government actually means. So for me, I think that's a really key moment for the government to set out like the practicalities of their key priorities and what that means for how government is going to work differently. So the kind of thing that I'll be looking out for kind of as we go through aftermath of budget into spending review is whether that mission-based approach is going to drive more kind of cross departmental collaborations. Traditionally, spending reviews tend to force everyone into their silos to think about, their own budgets, and actually some of these really big challenges that government is having to tackle are going to require cross-departmental collaborations. I'll be really interested to see that. I'll also be really interested to see, picking up on Rob's point, just quite how the devolution kind of agenda plays out and influences those kind of discussions. Again, we've seen encouraging signs with the first Council of the Nations and Regions happening up in Scotland in the run into the budget. But again, it will be interesting to plot through the extent to which that drives meaningful change and collaboration between the centre of government and the key nations and regions.
Excellent. Let's focus a little bit more on the public sector and the opportunities and barriers there, and whether any of them are going to be eased or in fact worsened by the budget. Aman, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think on the opportunity that one of the changes that came out of the budget was a change to fiscal rules. So sort of two changes around the stability rules, so day-to-day government spending, and then the investment rule was changed. And I think for me that gave kind of the scope and the wriggle room for greater public sector borrowing, certainly around infrastructure investment. And I think so the opportunity is, there. I think there's some of the detail that we've mentioned already around how do you access it. But ultimately projects that were previously deemed to be non-prioritized, unfunded, unfundable, could potentially become affordable. So, I think the sort of headline grabbing was £100 billion over the next 5 years. So I think that's the big opportunity. As I mentioned earlier, I think the challenges are we don't have the detail, not quite sure sector, regional deployment of that. But I think the challenge comes back to, do we have and will the supply chain and the public sector counterparties and the asset owners be what I would call tender ready? Are they ready to access? Do they know how to access the funding? And when that funding does become available, are they ready to deploy it in a time window which is meaningful to deliver on the infrastructure growth ambitions that the government have kind of set out? And I think, where's the labour market? Are people looking at our ability to implement the projects? Do we have the right skill mix currently in our supply chains? And I think that's, for me, it's probably been slightly overlooked, and actually it's probably quite a practical consideration. So that would be the sort of opportunities and some of the sort of challenges and barriers around making sure the supply chain is ready and people know how to access the capital.
And Julia,
hear your thoughts on this. You're someone who has quite a unique view on this, and something on this panel, in that you have actually worked for the Treasury previously and also within local devolved government.
Yeah, so I think it's there's never one solution, right? So the money alone isn't going to unlock the change. There has to be the delivery capacity to do that, and that's not just about kind of are the supply chains and is the delivery capacity there. It's have the right barriers to delivering been removed as well. And so I think the challenge is government being able to play its role in helping assemble and incentivize that full package. So if you take governments, massive, like big housing ambitions, they've clearly put down a very big marker on planning reform to try and kind of open up delivery. But so that alone isn't going to be enough. They haven't signaled whether there'll be any fiscal measures to support the planning measures when as and when the NPPF is finalised, as well as, where's the supply chain that's actually going to deliver the building. So I suppose it's like building that detailed understanding of what every domino and the role that it needs to play to actually open up that delivery. I think that's the key thing for me. I think more generally, I think one of the big challenge and remaining uncertainty, as has been said before, is just if you're not a protected department, despite some of the headlines about opening up investment and flexing the borrowing rules, actually your day-to-day resource and capacity could look like it's still going to stay quite challenging. Like, if you're not a protected department, it's still going to feel like quite a financially constrained environment for you to be operating in.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for that first part there, guys. Really interesting stuff and a good marker for us to lay down for the rest of the webinar. We're going to move on to our second audience poll now then. This is a bit of a temperature check from you as an audience around your overall feeling towards the new budget, whether it's positive or negative. So 1 is being incredibly negative about it, 4 being incredibly positive, and 2 and 3 being somewhere in the middle. So just another 10 seconds on that so we can see what the audience's overall feeling is towards the new budget, whether it is positive or negative. And I imagine that will probably be broken down quite clearly by what area of the public sector they work in. If you can close that poll now, please. So that's quite interesting that there's not too many people that are extremely positive about it, which is slightly concerning. Although not that many people who are particularly negative about it. So we're very much in the middle towards the lower side have been slightly negative about it. So it'd be really interesting to see potentially looking once we hear, say, from the spending reviews and maybe giving it 6 months' time, as we've talked about, as to whether there'll be any sort of change in that. We can talk now about sort of public and private sector investment. I think that's really important and a point you've already sort of begun to touch on, guys. But we'll go to you on this one, Rob. Do you think it's going to open up more of that investment?
The short answer is yes, but I think it's kind of indirectly. I don't think there's necessarily anything in the budget where you would go as a member of the private sector and say, right, that's going to open up huge amounts of new spending. But I think the reality is that growth can't happen without the public and the private sector working together. Fixing some of the big challenges in our public services can't happen without the public-private sector working together. The ongoing kind of delivery of programs and investments that started under the previous government can't happen without the public and private sector working together. So I think absolutely there will be, because there has to be. I think where there is a particular gap is the need for, I suppose, more innovative kind of financial solutions. What are the alternative financial models that get public and private working together? I think it's a problem that's crying out to be fixed. I think there will need to be a softening on some of the way that Treasury view, I guess, some of the roles and the cards that they have in their hands, whether that be kind of guarantees to try and attract the private sector in, or whether that's a way in which they can sort of open up more opportunity. So I think some of this is about Treasury probably trying to get on board with this. But I think there's also a challenge kind of to all of us who work in that kind of public-private space to say, well, how can we help the public sector be more innovative? Where could we look at some of the sectors we work in, some of the work we're doing, and say, well, actually, is there a potential new model there, something different that could be used and brought forward? And I think I would hope that the civil servants in the departments, the kind of sort of sector leads, they'd be really interested in hearing about those, because actually that's going to be the key challenge. It's not trying to fix the sort of some of these problems that have been around for a long time with the same options, but can we identify collectively something new that would really help to drive more money into the public sector?
Julia, a case of more collaboration then, do you think?
So I think the framing of the budget, if you look at things like the National Wealth Fund as well, there's clearly kind of ambition and the intent to make public and private sector collaboration and investment easier and to do it at greater scale. What we haven't yet seen is the detail of that. There are pitfalls. There's always that risk that sometimes, rather than actually helping lever in private and institutional investment, public sector funding can crowd it out. But I suppose my key message on all of this would be, yes, there's stuff that central government can do to help explore and promote new models, and we're definitely up for supporting that conversation. But actually, there's plenty we can do in the meantime that doesn't require permission from central government. So if I look at some of L&G's most successful partnerships, they basically boil down to finding an alignment of values and mission with your partner organisations and that shared will just to crack on with it. We did it in Newcastle, in the Helix there. Like, we regenerated a site in the city centre that had previously been an open cast coal mine that is now cutting edge innovation campus. And we were able to do that because all the key partners decided that we were going to crack on and get on with it. And it's been a massive success. So I do think there's a bit of the mindset of like how kind of proceed with the art of the possible, and then there will always be more that government can do, but like there's plenty we can do in our current, there's still plenty to go after, even in our current state. So that's what I would encourage people, the mindset for people to have.
You're not the first person to use the phrase "the art of the possible" in a webinar or around since the budget. I think there's a lot of feeling around that, and actually positivity, which is always good to see. I think there is a bit of a positive push on that. Let's move on to funding now. New funding sources that are becoming available, and how can they be used effectively? Aman, we'll go to you on this one first.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two headline ones coming out or sort of post the budget. Jude's mentioned the National Wealth Fund, which is additional multi-billions of capital being deployed by what was the UK Infrastructure Bank directly into local authorities to support with funding. So I think some of the risk profile of that funding and the specific types of projects, but you know, funding digital, funding a broader set of criteria that maybe the UK Infrastructure Bank wasn't doing, which I think is interesting, but you know, not even the National Wealth Fund quite understand what the funding they're getting, what the criteria and what the investment criteria is. So I think that feels like a headline grabbing and a vehicle to deploy, but detail and investment criteria TBC. I think the other one was kind of local government pension reform. So kind of post budget, but so I think Rachel Reeves on a couple of occasions has looked externally, principally Canada and Australian systems, and kind of gone to 8 mega pension funds, which is similar to the Canadian model. However, so I think that there's the broad structure and changes being made, which I think is a really positive sign. I think it's difference being the Maple 8 in Canada generally invest outside of Canada, and I think it's quite interesting that the opening up of 8 mega funds, pension mega funds, to invest in the UK is actually a distinctly different model to what the Canadian model is, albeit there's a sort of idea that public pension funds can fill some of the funding void. So I think for me they're the kind of two big funding sources that you know, local government and the public sector need to understand how to access and how to leverage.
Yeah, Julia, anything to add on that one?
I'd just say, just beyond that, one of the things that I'll be watching with interest is the Trailblazer combined authorities and the progress they make on establishing single pot settlements. So for me, that feels like that could be a real space where you'll see innovation in place-based funding approaches that are directed towards outcomes rather than kind of activity-based, you know, or departmental allocations that are then just reflected into the regions. So it'll be really interesting. I think expectations have been set quite high there in terms of how strategic that will be. It'll be really interesting to see just quite what the follow through and what the reality ends up looking like.
And Rob, anything from you on this one?
I think a couple of things. So building on Julia, I think that's absolutely right in terms of the role around devolution and how do they tie it into some of their missions and some of their big priorities. So, for instance, could you say to places, actually, if you help deliver some of our housing targets, you can keep some of the stamp duty over so you can actually create that kind of shared deal between the public and the private sector. Again, it will require a bit of boldness. But actually, if you could really get places working, you could see a number of scenarios. So yeah, you see one around house building, you can see one around even kind of national insurance contributions if you were to grow your economy, create jobs, etc., etc. Those are they're kind of biggish ideas, but I think there is a bit of potential, and as confidence grows in particularly the Trailblazer areas and the mayors there, I think there's real opportunity. I mean, I think interestingly, there was no kind of, when Blair came in 97, there was kind of New Deal for communities. Boris Johnson had his kind of levelling up fund. There was no big regen program. Now that could be a good thing in sense of it sort of removes this idea of kind of constant bidding wars, the kind of whole political argument about why a place is picked. But I think it is quite interesting because certainly local government has benefited from a number of years from using those kind of monies to enable certain projects to get going, to support delivery around high street programs, town centre regen. So there is a bit of a gap there. I think it will be interesting to see whether that is a gap that gets plugged over time.
Also, just beyond the cash allocations, it would be quite interesting to see whether mechanisms like task forces get used again to try and bolster capacity that will help support delivery. So we've seen that around planning officers, so central resource that can then be targeted to help provide capacity where it's needed. It'll be interesting to see if that approach gets applied in other areas, perhaps maybe in helping bolster investment capability in places too, to help them kind of attract and secure wider investment too.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, we'll actually go back on to levelling up again in a moment, because it is a topic that's very, very, very hot and certainly something that needs discussing. So we'll just get into we're about halfway through the questions to our panel that we've already kind of planned, but we'd love to get questions in from you guys as the audience. So if there's still time to get any questions in, please use the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and we'll try and get to a few of those by the end of the session. But now it's time for another poll. So do you think the October budget provides adequate funding to support effective public service delivery at the local level? 1 to 4 as always, 1 not being very adequate and 4 being very adequate. So I'll give you another 10 seconds on that, because I appreciate it's been on screen while I've been waffling on. And if we could close that poll now, please. And again, it's reflective of the kind of overall sentiment that we've seen so far with these polls, towards the lower end of it not being particularly adequate in sense of the funding for public service delivery. So again, really interesting. It follows on to our next question, which does reference levelling up. As Rob said, there was no big sort of levelling up successor announced as part of the budget. But do we think the levelling up agenda has evolved following that sort of lack of clear direction within the early stage? We'll go to you first on this one, Rob, but it'd be good to get your thoughts on this as well, Julia, afterwards.
Well, as a policy name, absolutely, it's disappeared, and that's not a surprise. I mean, that was trailed in many ways before the Labour Party even came to power, and it was so tied with kind of the previous administration. It's not a surprise. I think the really important issue is what levelling up fundamentally was shorthand for, which is regional disparity, and the fact that there are a number of places across the country for where the gap on a whole host of measures is big, and it's getting bigger. That is still a challenge. So the kind of underlying principle, forget about the policy name, I mean, it's absolutely still there, and I think it's one of the big challenges personally facing the country. I think even if Labour were to really drive great significant growth and sort of hit the headline measures in terms of kind of UK PLC, without some sort of explicit focus on how you start to address these kind of issues and these disparities, and it's not just kind of it's disparities within sub-regions. It's not just a kind of north-south divide. And we need to be careful we don't kind of slip into that. It's not about kind of limiting London's growth so everywhere can close. No, these are deep set structural problems, and I think there's got to be some focus on it. I think devolution could be part of the answer. So you enable the people who know the place better to really start to tackle it. I think it's about how they then use things like the industrial strategy. So one of my kind of bugbears has been, all too often we will say, oh, where's the sort of UK capital for life sciences? Well, it's in about 8 different places because everywhere's claiming to be the centre for life sciences. Or where is it for some of our AI? Where is it for offshore wind? Now, sometimes it will be spread around the country, but I think it will be really interesting to see with plans around industrial strategy, whether there is a bit more intentionality around really backing places. There's pros and cons to that. I'm not going to be naive about it. There's politics to it, but I think actually how we use the industrial strategy to really support some of these places and really help try and channel inward investment, international investment, but also kind of intra-regional investment into these places to start to address those issues, I think will be key. So yes, I don't think we're going to get a levelling up too, but I think we will have to have something that addresses regional disparities.
So levelling up the brand, as it were, is no more, but the concept very much still should be alive and strong. Julia, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, the branding has definitely gone. But the political salience is still going to be absolutely key. As Rob said, if ultimately the success of this government is going to be judged on economic success. That isn't just in UK PLC terms, that's on whether individuals and the communities that they live in feel like they're making progress and are feeling better off. I think also what's evolved in this debate, and actually I think has matured, it's moved on from being a political bat into a more mature debate. I think back to what Andy Burnham said after that first meeting of the Nations of Regions, was that actually this was a forum that wasn't about political posturing, it was about kind of putting collective heads together and working out how they can work together, you know, almost blind to some of the big political differences between the politicians sat around the table. I think what we've also seen over the course of this year is the kind of maturing of this kind of combined authority, mayoral combined authority world. So we had a new cohort of mayoral combined authorities elected in May this year. We've seen further county combined authority deals as well. So it does feel like those kind of structures are becoming more secure and embedded, and that is being reflected in the nature of the political debate. It's being reflected in the kind of ways in which funding gets allocated. We'll see, and the way in like basically where powers and resources sit. So I think it feels like it's becoming a bit more of a more structured and established part of our governance, basically, not just a kind of political rallying call.
Yeah, as someone who lives and works in one of those areas that now is under a combined authority and a metro mayor, it's there's certainly a bit of a temperature change going on there. We're going to move on to social value now. Actually, we'll stick with you on this one, Julia. How will your organisation deliver on social value within this sort of newly announced budget?
Well, it feels like some of the things that we've talked about in terms of the appetite to bring public and private sector investment together are really closely aligned with what L&G as a business, and actually my role as head of social impact and investment. It's absolutely about working in really close partnership with places, starting with where is there a societal need for investment, and then taking that conversation into, and how can we as institutional investors help you meet that societal need. So for us, it just feels like, you know, even greater opportunity to really push on that approach and to try and maximize the investment that we can help unlock, because at the end of the day our starting point is, you know, we're stewarding people's pensions money, and of course we have responsibility to make sure that we get a return so that they get their pensions in retirement, but at the same time we think it's, you know, there's a responsibility for us to also be able to demonstrate to those people that we are investing in things that make a difference to the community that they live into. So it feels like there's absolutely clear alignment, and if there's opportunity to do more of that and work with more places, and the budget helps enable that, and wider priorities for the government, then that's absolutely fantastic. And we're really up for scaling, and we'll look for any opportunity to do so.
Alan, we'll come to you on this one as well, because obviously the social value very much a cornerstone of the Pagabo Group, and it's sort of what it stands for. So what's Pagabo's kind of views on how social value is going to be delivered within the new sort of newly announced budget?
Yeah, look, I think the government continues to emphasise social value, you know, within public sector procurement, and you know, as you said, that's public spending that sort of delivers broader social, economic, and environmental benefits, and I think that tie with procurement allows us uniquely to be able to ensure we're delivering the best quality, and quality being measured by social impact and social value rather than necessarily some of the measurement that historically has kind of been measured. So I think it's moving social value on in terms of using that in combination with procurement to ensure it's really delivering. I think clearly we have we own and operate the metric system, and we have a unique position to move that on and ensure that we're continually investing in quality to make sure that there are tools. I think our other area, how we as an organization help, is making it really easy through digital first tools, so that this is a widely understood space. It's easy to measure and it's easy to interact with, in terms of them being able to value the impact that projects are making. I think for us that's how we as an organisation are continuing to lead on social value and want to continue to improve, you know, in this space.
Excellent. Well, we've actually got a Pagabo Live first coming up now, because I actually know the answer for sure to one of our questions. Does the UK have enough skilled workers within the construction industry to deliver on the targets set by the budget? No. We're not just going to move on. We're going to ask the question, and we'll go to you, Aman, on this one. But it's more of a how do we get to that point where we do have those skilled workers? Because there certainly aren't enough at the minute, are there?
No, you've answered the question, so I don't need to in that respect. Look, I think, you know, we it's not anything specific around the budget. I think the aspirations to increase the level of investment is fantastic. I think there's challenges around the construction sector, specifically around skilled workers, bricklaying, carpentry. You know, and it's sort of been well trailed, but also the professional skills around. You know, do we have enough engineers, project managers, planners to implement and deploy the kind of level of investment that we're talking about here? And I think that the devil will always be in the detail, but also how does that lay out in terms of deployment? So what's the answer? Yeah, I don't know. I'll offer some thoughts. I think it's training. You know, and I didn't hear much, you know, other than bits around how do we actually attract the talent? How do we ultimately deal with what is an aging workforce? How do we make this really attractive without it coming down to sort of inflationary impacts around paying people more? And then obviously there's the impact of the policies around, you know, and dovetailing with immigration and how we're going to get the skilled workers in, how we're going to train them. And how we're going to make this industry, you know, on either side more attractive to the young people who are probably more physically, you know, able to do some of the work that's required. So, you know, what's the answer? It's investment in training. It's looking at probably some modern methods of construction. Does that help? Not sure. And talent attraction for me.
It's it really is the $1 million question, isn't it? And certainly from having been involved in a few of these sort of events since the budget and questions being asked around that skills gap, we don't have enough of anything, essentially. We don't have enough, as you say, engineers, planners. There's a shortage of pretty much every single in pretty much every single part of the construction industry. So it's a heck of a question to be asking this time on a Wednesday afternoon. So just to wrap up before we go into kind of audience Q&A, I'd like a bit of a kind of closing thought from each of you guys. Thinking to the future, what do you think are the biggest milestones the government needs to achieve in order to deliver for the public sector and show that the budget and essentially, you know, the new government is actually performing? Aman, we'll start with you on this one because I gave you the hard one last time.
Thanks. Yeah, I think this was a budget that was trailed about growth, and therefore, in terms of the biggest milestone is, yeah, the country's been challenged with that over a number of years. So does this plan deliver growth? I think for me that is a sort of simple milestone that we can measure. You know, consistently over a period of time, and you know, frankly, if we can't unlock the growth, then we'll be coming back and talking about another budget in you know, not too distant future, which is probably slightly more aggressive because Plan A hasn't quite delivered.
Julia, your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, that's got to be the big picture kind of proof point. Interested, like maybe below that or contributing to that, what we've seen since the new government was elected, they've made a really big deal out of their housing targets. And you know, we saw in the early days the planning reforms laid down as an example of kind of how radical and tough they were planning to be to follow through. So it almost feels like that's a proof point, not of what they're trying to achieve, but how they were going to go about doing it. I think it'd be really interesting to revisit that in a year's time, just to see whether the extent to which government has been able to follow through on that intent from the early days of their government.
Excellent. And just to wrap up on this one, Rob, please.
Yeah, a couple of things just to agree with everything that's been said. I think there's some quite practical. They've promised various white papers. They've promised more detail on various things. So we need to see those. I think those become kind of interim milestones, if we can call them that. They're not going to solve the problem because they're just going to be papers, and detail, but actually, do they enable that? I then think also there's some important questions around the missions. Julia mentioned it earlier. The manifesto was big around a number of clear missions that had big, bold, ambitious things that can be measured. Does this budget start to help move the dial on some of those things? And then the third thing, I think, actually, do we strengthen the foundation so that we can start to make some longer term spending decisions? So actually, in budgets we see in the future, they're not just short term, but there's some longer term commitments that can be entered into with confidence.
Brilliant stuff. Well, thank you very much for that first section of the webinar, guys. We've got our final audience poll here for you to join in with everybody. So, how aware are you now of the key changes facing the public sector following the delivery of the October budget? So the same question we asked right at the start, we're asking you again at the end, and hopefully we'll see a nice measurable increase, and hopefully the panel will have done their job this afternoon. Just another 10 seconds on that, please, before closing up, Matt. And while we're waiting on those 10 seconds, just a reminder to get your questions in using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. It may be hidden under the More section at the bottom of your screen, but yeah, please feel free to ask any questions to the panel. I know I've got a couple that you've got a burning desire to be asking. So looking at the results then, and that's a really positive shift. So looking at that, we're at more than 77% of people in that higher end of awareness now. So congratulations, panel. You've done a good job so far. We'll see what happens with these last kind of 10, 15 minutes or so as we go into our audience Q&A. And I'll go to you first, Aban, because it's something that's really interested me. You mentioned it was mentioned earlier as the Department for Value for Money, obviously over in the States as well. They're looking at exactly the same thing with their Department for Government Efficiency, which is run by Elon Musk. I'm interested to see what the impact, or what you think the impact of that might be on the procurement industry as a whole, which obviously Pagabo is a large part of.
Yeah, look, I think it's a new thing, but it's kind of something that's been around. I think it's kind of almost kind of been rebranded, seemingly this side of the this side of the pond and the other. I think the target is around government's goal is to boost efficiency across all departments by 2%. I think some of that's been sort of the trail there around kind of halving spending on management consultants and consolidating services across government agencies. But I think the other area is leveraging technology to streamline operations. So I think for me it's essential for the supply chain and anybody kind of working with the public sector to think about how they can, against this very kind of visible target around those kind of areas, to say, look, there's a 2% efficiency target in that process of tendering and working with public sector. How is the supply chain and how is the private sector going to help deliver against that target around kind of productivity, use of digital systems, and obviously from a procurement perspective, we have a channel that we operate that allows us to support in that overall kind of achieving of that 2% efficiency target. So I think that's probably how I would see that.
Yeah, it's interesting that procurement is often seen as a little bit of a whipping boy when it comes to creating efficiencies. So I'd be really interested to see how the industry sort of shapes up and moves along.
And I think, and if I could just jump in on that,
yeah,
I suppose it's just being really, how do you make sure that like government sees getting maximum value for the public pound in terms of delivering maximum impact as well, not just kind of achieving lowest possible cost or that, the greatest possible return. So I always think of kind of the many failed attempts to try and unlock the one public estate, and that as a public asset, there's a there's a property value in that, but there's also the value that kind of thinking about it creatively could unlock in bringing more broader benefits to communities in terms of how they dispose of that land and who they work with. So that's the bit that I hope, the baby that I hope doesn't get thrown out with the bathwater, is the ability to really be creative with the resources at government's disposal to maximise impact, which is, for me, is part of that broader definition of value for money. It's not just about reducing cost.
Yes, the age-old cost versus value argument back in
Yeah.
before. Actually, we'll stay with you on this, Julie, because I feel like it's slightly related as well, and it's a question that came up at a similar event that I was involved in. Do we think that government, in the sense of the civil service, do we think it's too large? Is there too much red tape? Is that one of the problems that's restricting growth at the moment?
I think, I don't know. I mean, if I think back to my personal experiences working in a region and working in central government, I think sometimes collaboration is harder than it should be. So I think for me personally, it's how do you create space to do the kind of creative, collaborative work, which I think quite often just gets crowded out. If you're in local government, you're absolutely beaten down. You've got rising pressures on your statutory responsibilities and all the resources going on that. I think it's that space just to take a step back and, for central and regional government to be able to have conversations that are about, given all of the resources that we have at our disposal, do we have an agreed set of priorities for a place, and how do we use those resources in a way that's going to help unlock them? It feels like there's not enough space for those, and actually quite often it's the psychology of departments and other kind of public sector organisations that can sometimes almost get in the way. Like, local and central government can almost have this kind of in local government, it's really that, as Rob talked about with the competitive funding rounds, it's really easy to get into the mindset of like, we can't do anything unless we ask for more money or we ask for permission, rather than we're just going to proceed until apprehended because we think it's the right thing. Even between departments, quite often you'll see that kind of competitive element rather than collaborative. So that's where I would just be really, the missions is a real opportunity to try and break through some of that, and I'll be really interested to see how it plays out.
Thanks, Julia. That's always good to get insights from someone who is in practical experience on the ground in those situations. A final one from me for you, Rob. Obviously, we've mentioned about levelling up funding. There's a lot of EU funding that used to exist for regeneration that now we don't have access to. There's a big gap to fill, isn't there, for regeneration? So where do we see that funding and that impetus coming from? Is there place for something to kind of jump into that spot?
The short answer is, I mean, there's not a kind of public sector pot, but I think it is really interesting. Organisations like Legal & General, we're in conversations with Legal & General and others who are very, very interested in working with the public sector, because actually objectives, visions, ambitions, kind of purposes align, and there is some real opportunity. I think it's about just getting that risk reward balance right, and the big question for me in that is where can government kind of, if you like, use its balance sheet, change some of its rules so that it just makes it easier for that to happen, and actually you're kind of giving permission to those places, just as you talk, to sort of get on and do it themselves. If you've got a good project that's going to make a genuine difference to a place, actually there are a number of private sector investors who would be very, very interested in deploying capital into that. How do we make it easier? Some of that's around the kind of rules, the fiscal rules that sit around that. Some of that's around actually just kind of helping build a bit of capacity with individual places to have those commercial conversations, to help them feel that they've got the support, they can negotiate a deal. Some of that's about actually creating sort of common term sheets and very sort of simple documentation, just so you can sort of speed up the process. And I think, interestingly, to your earlier question around the sort of scale of the civil service, I think if some of that was to help capacity in places, boost capacity in places, kind of do it once for multiple places, I think actually we could see some things really accelerate. and we could see potentially some of these new models. Certainly, we're doing quite a bit of work around the kind of leisure sector, and there is definite interest there. The big question is how do you kind of make some of it more common so that it isn't having to be repeated multiple times by lots of different places at often fairly significant cost in terms of time and money.
Excellent. Thanks, Robert. That's a really nice positive note to end on there as well. So that is unfortunately what I've got time for today. Thank you very much to Aman, to Rob, and Julia for your involvement in the panel today. And thank you very much to you all for tuning in. We had really good audience numbers again today. So thank you very much for your continued support of Pagabo Live. Now, you are all part now of the Pagabo Live community, so you'll receive a link for our next session in December, the details of which are on the screen now, Wednesday the 11th of December, so it is coming up fairly soon, and it'll be an update on procurement reform and planning for 2025. There'll also be a newsletter coming out around a week after each Pagabo Live session. So that'll have a recording of the webinar, a video if you want to watch us, and you can even listen to us on whatever podcast platform you like to listen to. You'll get further insights from the team as well in that newsletter. Hopefully you found today useful. If you have, please tell a colleague and share it with them. And we'll see you next month for our last session of 2025. Thank you very much.